It was October 1941, in a small Serbian town called Kragujevac, when something unthinkable happened. German soldiers gathered thousands of innocent people, teachers, workers, students, ordinary families, and lined them up on an open field. These people had done nothing wrong. They were chosen randomly, pulled from their homes, simply because a German military unit had been attacked somewhere nearby. The order that sealed their fate came from the highest levels of command, cold and calculated. For every single German soldier killed, 100 Serbian civilians must die. That morning, in just a few hours, over 2,000 lives were erased. There was no trial, no judge, no mercy, just death, delivered like an administrative task. This wasn't a random act of wartime chaos. This was the beginning of something far darker. A systematic campaign of revenge that would sweep across an entire region, leaving scars that still haven't fully healed today. While the world remembers the horrors of Auschwitz and the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the crimes committed in the Balkans have largely been forgotten, buried under decades of silence and political complications. But the story remains, waiting in the ruins of burned villages and mass graves scattered across the mountains. It's a story about how human lives became nothing more than numbers in the machinery of Nazi vengeance, and how an entire region was crushed under the weight of a war that showed no limits and no humanity. By early 1941, Nazi Germany had already conquered most of Europe. Hitler's forces controlled France, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and much of the continent. Now Hitler turned his gaze eastward, toward the Soviet Union. He was preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion that he believed would win him the war. But before launching that attack, he needed to secure his southern border. The Balkans sat right there, in a critical position between Central Europe and the Mediterranean Sea. This region wasn't just land, it was a strategic gold mine. It controlled vital railway lines that connected Germany to Greece and Turkey. It held mineral resources that fueled war industries, and most importantly, it bordered Romania, where Germany got most of its oil. Without control of the Balkans, Hitler's entire southern flank would be exposed. The Balkans included the territories of Yugoslavia, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Macedonia, along with Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, and parts of what is now Turkey. It was a patchwork of nations, languages, and religions, already fragile and divided. Hitler saw opportunity in that division. On April 6, 1941, without warning, without any declaration of war, German forces launched simultaneous invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece. Bombs rained down on Belgrade. Luftwaffe planes filled the skies. Within just 11 days, Belgrade was a smoking ruin, and the Yugoslav government had surrendered. Greece tried to resist, but after a series of brutal air raids and ground assaults, it too fell into Axis hands. In less than 3 weeks, the entire Balkan peninsula was under German control. The speed was shocking. The destruction was complete. Germany immediately began carving up the region. Serbia was placed under direct German military occupation, with a command headquarters established in Belgrade. Croatia was turned into a so-called independent state, but in reality it was a puppet government controlled by a fascist organization called the Ustaše. Greece was divided into 3 zones, one controlled by Germany, one by Italy, and one by Bulgaria. Every piece of the Balkans became a link in Berlin's chain of exploitation. The goal was clear: turn the region into a buffer zone, extract its resources, crush any resistance, and use its people as cheap labor for the German war machine. Puppet governments were installed. Local police forces were reorganized to serve the occupiers, and anyone who resisted would face consequences beyond imagination. By the summer of 1941, resistance began to spread. In the forests of Yugoslavia, 2 major armed groups emerged. One was the Partisan Army, led by Josip Broz Tito, a communist organizer who believed in multi-ethnic unity and a future socialist Yugoslavia. The other was the Chetniks, a royalist group led by Draža Mihailović, who wanted to restore the monarchy. They disagreed on almost everything politically, but they shared one enemy: Nazi Germany. Small attacks began: ambushes on German supply convoys, sabotage of railways, hit-and-run raids on military outposts. At first, these attacks seemed minor, barely a nuisance. But for the Germans, any resistance was intolerable, and their response was swift and brutal. On September 16, 1941, General Franz Böhme, the commander of German forces in Serbia, issued a directive that would become infamous. It was simple, direct, and monstrous. For every German soldier killed, 100 civilians would be executed. For every German soldier wounded, 50 civilians would be arrested or killed. This wasn't a threat made in anger. This was official policy, written down, distributed to officers, and carried out with methodical precision. It marked the beginning of what would later be called the Balkans' darkest chapter. A wave of atrocities that swept through villages, towns, and cities, leaving behind nothing but grief and ashes. In mid-October 1941, after partisans ambushed a German patrol and killed several soldiers, the German forces moved into action. They surrounded the town, arrested every man they could find, and dragged them to a nearby airfield. There was no investigation, no trial, no questions asked. They were simply lined up and shot, one after another. About 2,000 people were killed in just 2 days. A week later, the horror repeated itself in Kragujevac. On October 21st, German troops surrounded the entire town and forced every male resident, including high school students, out of their homes. Teachers, workers, teenagers barely old enough to shave. They were all gathered together. Then, in cold blood, more than 2,700 people were executed. Among them were boys just 16 or 17 years old, still in their school uniforms. The executions were carried out in retaliation for the deaths of just 10 German soldiers. 10 lives, traded for more than 2,700. The massacre shocked even some of Germany's allies. After the war, Kragujevac became a symbol of German collective punishment in Serbia, a name spoken with pain and anger across the region. These massacres weren't accidents. They weren't the result of panicked soldiers losing control. They were deliberate, calculated, and part of a broader strategy. The Germans believed that only absolute terror could keep the local population under control and crush the resistance before it spread. But the strategy failed. The more people they killed, the more the resistance grew. Entire families joined the partisans after watching their fathers and brothers executed. Villages that had stayed neutral became active resistance strongholds overnight. Thousands of homes were burned. Entire communities disappeared from the map. Tens of thousands went missing, their fates unknown. The Germans had hoped to break the spirit of the Serbian people. Instead, they ignited a fire that would burn until the end of the war. After Yugoslavia fell, Germany didn't need to occupy every inch of territory directly. In Croatia, they created a puppet state called the Independent State of Croatia, known by its Croatian initials, NDH. Its leader was Ante Pavelić, the head of the Ustaše, a far-right fascist movement that had been waiting for this moment for years. Germany and Italy recognized the new government, provided weapons, military advisors, and logistical support. In return, the Ustaše pledged to purify the territory, a chilling euphemism for ethnic cleansing. Their targets were Serbs, Jews, and Roma, anyone who didn't fit their vision of a pure Croatian state. In 1941, the ethnic cleansing began on a terrifying scale. Serbian villages across Bosnia and Croatia were surrounded by Ustaše militias. Men were arrested. Women and children were expelled from their homes, forced to walk for miles with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some were sent to concentration camps, where conditions were brutal and deadly. Forced labor, starvation, disease, and summary executions became daily occurrences. By early 1942, mass killings had become a regular part of the NDH's administration. At the center of this nightmare was a place called Jasenovac, a concentration camp located on the banks of the Sava River. Established in August 1941, it was commanded by Vjekoslav Luborić, a loyal Ustaše officer known for his cruelty. Jasenovac was one of the largest camps in Europe not directly run by Germany, but it operated under the same horrifying model. It held Serbs, Jews, Roma, political opponents, and anyone the regime considered undesirable. Prisoners were forced into backbreaking labor. Many died from starvation, disease, or outright execution during so-called cleanup operations. After the war, Yugoslav investigators estimated that between 80,000 and 100,000 people died at Jasenovac. The majority were Serbs, followed by Jews and Roma. German documents later revealed that Berlin was fully aware of what was happening but chose not to intervene. For Hitler's regime, the Ustaše were a convenient tool. They kept the Balkans under control without requiring Germany to deploy additional troops. The brutality of the Ustaše shocked even some German officers. Reports sent back to Berlin described violence that went beyond anything they had seen on other fronts. Yet Berlin did nothing to stop it. For Hitler, the destruction of the Serbian population only served his interests. He considered the Serbs a dangerous, rebellious people, and their suffering was, in his eyes, strategically useful. In Bosnia, the situation became even more complicated. The region's overlapping ethnic and religious groups turned the war into a nightmarish mix of political conflict and ancient hatreds. German forces and the Ustaše regularly coordinated in so-called anti-partisan operations. These campaigns, which lasted from 1942 to 1944, destroyed hundreds of villages and caused tens of thousands of civilian deaths. Throughout this period, German SS units remained active across the region. They didn't just supervise, they participated directly in the repression. Units like the SS Prince Eugen Division and the Handschar Division operated in the mountains of Bosnia and Montenegro, working alongside the Ustaše and local collaborators. Their methods were always the same: surround a village, confiscate all food and supplies, take hostages, and carry out mass executions after every partisan attack. The result was catastrophic. A massive portion of the Serbian population in Croatia and Bosnia was wiped out. Post-war Yugoslav records documented more than 700,000 deaths among minority groups, killed in massacres, camps, or forced marches. After Yugoslavia collapsed, Germany's invasion quickly expanded southward. In April 1941, German forces pushed into Greece. By the end of the month, Athens had fallen. Greece was divided among Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria. Germany took the most strategically important regions, including Athens, Thessaloniki, and key islands. Italy occupied much of the rest, while Bulgaria seized control of Thrace. The occupation immediately pushed Greece into crisis. Germany began purchasing grain and other goods at artificially low fixed prices, which triggered widespread famine. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, more than 100,000 Greeks died from starvation and disease. Cities like Athens and Piraeus became scenes of desperation. People collapsed in the streets. Children begged for scraps of bread. Meanwhile, German troops continued seizing food supplies to feed their own soldiers. At the same time, Greek resistance movements began to form. From the mountains of Thessaly to the rocky terrain of the Peloponnese, groups like EAM and ELAS emerged, attacking supply convoys, sabotaging railways, and ambushing German patrols. Facing this resistance, Germany applied the same brutal retaliation tactics they had used in Serbia. Entire villages suspected of aiding partisans were erased from the map. In December 1943, a pivotal massacre occurred in the mountain village of Kalavrita. After 78 German soldiers were captured and executed by Greek resistance fighters, the 117th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht surrounded the village. Every male over the age of 14 was gathered in a nearby field. Around 700 were shot in cold blood. Women and children were locked inside the village school, which was then set on fire. When German troops finally withdrew, the entire village lay in ashes. 6 months later, tragedy struck again in Distomo, a small village in central Greece. On June 10, 1944, an SS unit from the 4th SS Polizei Panzer Grenadier Division was ambushed nearby. In retaliation, they entered Distomo and killed 218 people, including 38 children. A German internal report coldly stated that the necessary measures had been carried out. No one was ever punished for giving that order. Similar massacres occurred across Greece. in Comeno on the island of Kefalonia, and in Vianos, on Kefalonia, after Italy surrendered to the Allies in 1943. More than 5,000 Italian soldiers were executed by the Germans simply for refusing to hand over their weapons. In Comeno, 317 civilians were killed in a matter of hours. After Italy's surrender in September 1943, German forces immediately moved to occupy the territories their former ally had controlled, including Albania and Montenegro. Their objective was to prevent partisan forces from opening supply routes to the Adriatic Sea and to secure a retreat corridor from Greece. Once in control, the Germans launched what they called anti-partisan campaigns. In reality, these were systematic campaigns of destruction. Villages were surrounded, civilians were rounded up, and entire communities were burned to the ground. In Montenegro, the SS Prince Eugen Division became notorious. Under the pretext of hunting partisans, they carried out a brutal policy of scorched earth, burning, capturing, and killing everything in their path. On June 7, 1943, in the village of Pljevlja, SS troops, together with Ustaše forces and local collaborators, surrounded the entire area. In a single day, 522 people were killed, including 109 children. Homes were set ablaze, livestock was seized, and the village of Pljevlja was erased from the map in less than 24 hours. A year later, on July 28, 1944, the massacre at Velika repeated the same horror. 2 SS divisions, Prince Eugen and Skanderbeg, entered the Plav region of Montenegro after failing to crush a partisan stronghold. They burned the village of Velika and killed more than 400 people, most of them women, elderly and young children. Survivors later recalled that SS soldiers went from house to house, methodically killing everyone they found. After the war, the Yugoslav government confirmed the death toll at around $550. From October 1943 to the spring of 1944, similar campaigns spread across Albania. Many villages were completely destroyed, and residents were either forcibly displaced or sent to labor camps in Germany. Areas suspected of harboring partisans were often leveled entirely to prevent reoccupation. Tens of thousands of Albanians were killed or went missing during this period. Slovenia suffered a similar fate. After being divided among Germany, Italy, and Hungary, the regions of Styria and Carniola were placed under German control. Berlin implemented a harsh policy of Germanization, expelling local Slovenian populations to replace them with ethnic Germans. From mid-1941 to 1942, more than 37,000 Slovenians were forcibly relocated to Austria and Germany. Thousands more were sent to concentration camps for allegedly supporting the resistance. Everywhere the German army went, the pattern was the same. Villages burned, populations vanished, farmlands left in ruins. These campaigns didn't just change the demographic map of the Balkans. They left consequences that would last for decades. By late 1944, the war had turned against Germany. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Allies were pushing through Italy, and Tito's partisans were growing stronger every day. German forces began their retreat from the Balkans. But as they withdrew, they tried to erase every trace of their crimes. Commanders ordered the destruction of records, the burning of camps, and the elimination of witnesses. In Croatia, the Jasenovac camp was dismantled piece by piece. Thousands of prisoners were executed just before the partisans arrived, and the entire camp was burned to destroy all evidence. In Greece, SS units destroyed detention facilities and retreated quickly through Macedonia, leaving behind scorched earth and scattered bodies. The cover-up was organized and deliberate. Wehrmacht and SS records were either destroyed or sent back to Germany in military convoys. Documents from the Yugoslav War Crimes Investigation Commission later showed that most files related to massacres in Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia were burned in Belgrade in October 1944, just days before Soviet troops entered the city. In Greece, the last German units blew up bridges and burned administrative offices before fleeing. But the truth could not stay buried forever. When Tito's partisans and the Red Army advanced through the Balkans in late 1944, they began uncovering mass graves. In Kragujevac, long trenches filled with thousands of bodies were found. In Velika and Pljevlja, entire villages were discovered leveled, with ashes and human remains mixed into the ruins. In Greece, the provisional government formed a special investigation commission that documented over 300 villages completely destroyed and tens of thousands killed in retaliatory actions. From 1945 onward, military tribunals began in Yugoslavia. Hundreds of collaborators and German officers were brought to trial. General Franz Böhme, who had issued the infamous 100-for-1 execution order, was captured in Austria but took his own life in prison before sentencing. Alexander Löhr, commander of German air forces in the Balkans, was captured in Zagreb, tried in Belgrade, and executed in 1947. Many other commanders were also brought before the courts and faced justice. In Croatia, Ustaše leaders were relentlessly hunted. Ante Pavelić fled to Austria and then to Argentina, living under a false identity. In 1957, he survived an assassination attempt but died 2 years later from his wounds. Vjekoslav Luburić, the commander of Jasenovac, fled to Spain and was killed in 1969 by a former prisoner seeking revenge. Although some escaped, most of the Ustaše leadership was captured and tried in Zagreb and Belgrade in 1946. The consequences of the war in the Balkans weren't just measured in deaths, they were measured in psychological scars that never fully healed. Hundreds of thousands went missing. Thousands of villages were erased. For years afterward, governments struggled to care for tens of thousands of orphans and disabled survivors. In Greece, more than 1/10 of the population was directly affected by famine, destruction, and displacement. In Yugoslavia, Tito ordered the construction of memorial complexes across the country. Kragujevac, Kalavrita, Jasenovac, and many other sites became national monuments, places where people could mourn and remember. Still, many areas remained unexcavated. Some war crimes files were kept classified throughout the Cold War, delaying justice for decades. But the physical evidence remained. The graves, the bones, the personal belongings uncovered in later excavations. They confirmed the true scale of the massacres and proved that the Nazi effort to erase their crimes could only delay, but never destroy, the truth. After the war ended, the Balkans entered a long period of silence. The pain was so immense that many generations chose to forget, or were forced to by political necessity. Under communist Yugoslavia, the massacres were grouped under the vague label of victims of fascism, without emphasizing ethnic or religious identities, in an effort to maintain national unity. That approach allowed for some temporary healing, but it also concealed countless personal stories and losses that were never publicly acknowledged or honored. When Yugoslavia collapsed in the 1990s, the memory of the war resurfaced with a vengeance. Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Slovenia each retold the past in their own way, often conflicting with one another. The number of victims, the role of each side, and even the definition of war crimes became subjects of bitter dispute. In Croatia, some extremist groups sought to deny or minimize the scale of Ustaše crimes, while in Serbia, many viewed themselves as the sole victims of the war. Historical truth became stretched and distorted between competing political narratives. Nevertheless, modern Europe has gradually changed its perspective. The European Union and UNESCO have recognized sites like Jasenovac, Kragujevac, and Kalavrita as international memorial sites of significance. These places are not just for remembrance, they serve as educational tools, teaching citizens about the consequences of extremism, hatred, and unchecked violence. Archaeological and digital archiving projects are now being developed to restore victim records, turning cold historical data into living memory that can be accessed, verified, and learned from by future generations. The true legacy of these massacres isn't just the crimes themselves. It's the warning they carry forward into the future. They remind us that hatred doesn't begin with gunfire. It begins the moment people stop seeing one another as human beings. When memory is distorted or erased, the past can return in another form, more subtle, quieter, but equally dangerous. Understanding the past isn't about nurturing anger or seeking revenge. It's about learning how to prevent tragedy from happening again. What happened in the Balkans shows that war doesn't only destroy cities and people. It breaks the moral foundation of an entire society. When law is replaced by command, and fear is used as a tool of control, every boundary of humanity can be crossed. The lesson that must be passed down through every generation is vigilance. Each of us bears the responsibility to keep this memory alive, not for revenge, but to understand the true value of peace and human dignity. Memorials are not just stone and steel. They are reminders that history does not forgive indifference. We cannot change what has happened, but we can choose to tell it honestly, compassionately, and with a vision for the future. Preserving memory isn't about looking back. It's about protecting humanity today from falling into the same darkness of yesterday.